It was supposed to be an ordinary night in June 1998. Dover, Ohio, was quiet. Families tucked inside their homes, the Tuscarawas River whispering in the dark. But when two teenage girls offered a stranger a ride, their night unraveled into horror. One girl's life was brutally taken. The other survived only by playing dead. This cold case would torment the community for years. Don't miss the untold truth. Subscribe now and turn on the bell for more cold case crime documentaries. On a balmy June night in 1998, the town of Dover, Ohio, seemed to rest in a perpetual twilight. Golden sunlight hanging low above the Tuscarawas River, streetlights flickering on as families gathered for dinner behind closed doors. Main Street hummed with a gentle, familiar rhythm. You could almost hear the crickets tuning up for their nightly symphony, their sound mingling with the distant whoosh of cars rolling over the bridge and the occasional laughter from the Dairy Queen parking lot. It was the kind of evening when nothing bad ever seemed possible, when youth and summer felt endless and the world felt safe and small. Abigail "Abby" Miller, 17 years old and already brimming with big city dreams, walked out of the mall's glass doors beside her best friend, Lindsay Parker. Abby had a camera slung over one shoulder and a bag of rented VHS tapes clutched in her arm. The kind of tapes with sun-faded covers, titles promising love, adventure, or a little harmless horror. She loved stories, the more thrilling the better, and often narrated her life as if it were a scene unfolding on screen. Lindsay, ever the cautious one, kept a nervous eye on the clock and a tighter grip on the car keys. She worried about curfews, about strange cars parked too long under the flickering mall lights, about the things people said happened out by the river late at night. But tonight, they had only one plan. A sleepover at Abby's house, junk food, and movies until their eyes closed. Abby's blue sedan, a hand-me-down with duct tape on the bumper and a persistent rattle in the dash, waited for them under the neon mall exit sign. The girls tumbled inside, laughter bubbling up as they recounted the way the cashier at the movie store had flirted with Lindsay, making her blush and stammer her way through the checkout. As Abby eased the car out of the lot and turned onto State Route 800, the windows rolled down and the warm summer air rushed in, carrying the scent of cut grass and river mud. The town was winding down for the night. Most of the little shops and restaurants shuttered. The parking lots empty except for a handful of old trucks and the odd cruiser from the local sheriff's department. A wave of contentment washed over Abby. This was her world, safe, known, held together by routine and friendship. They drove in companionable silence for a while, the static of a late-night radio show filling the space between them, until Lindsay finally cracked and started quizzing Abby on her favorite scenes from the movies they'd rented. Abby answered with mock seriousness, gesturing wildly and nearly spilling the sodas balanced between them. Neither girl noticed the battered figure standing in the shadow of the bus stop ahead, illuminated only for an instant by the car's headlights. The moment passed like a skipped heartbeat, but in its wake the atmosphere changed. A faint prickle ran down Lindsay's neck. Abby, ever oblivious to danger, just pressed the gas and sailed on. But the night, it seemed, was not quite finished with them. As they crossed the bridge by the river, Abby's car shuddered. Just a hiccup, but enough to make Lindsay glance nervously at the dashboard. The rattle in the engine grew louder for a few moments before subsiding. Abby joked about her trusty steed and how it was just one breakdown away from becoming local folklore. Minutes later, as they slowed for a stop sign at the edge of town, Lindsay noticed a figure approaching on foot from behind. A man, older than them, moving with a tired, loping gait. He lifted a hand in a tentative wave, his silhouette ragged in the sodium glow of the streetlight. Abby rolled down her window, heart untroubled, voice friendly. "You lost or something?" The man stepped closer. He looked worn, maybe late 20s, with a rough beard and eyes that darted from Abby to Lindsay and back again. He smiled, a crooked, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said he'd missed his bus home. He claimed he lived just a few blocks away. Could they give him a ride? He'd pay them for their trouble, he insisted, patting his pockets as if to prove he had money. Lindsay's every instinct screamed caution, but Abby, always eager to help, shrugged. "It's not that far, right?" There was an uneasy pause. The man's presence felt out of place here, in their small town bubble. The night, so warm and inviting before, seemed suddenly tense, as if holding its breath. Lindsay hesitated, glancing at Abby, then back at the stranger. The world seemed to shrink around them, the street empty, houses quiet, no headlights in sight. Abby unlocked the back door. The man slid in. The smell of sweat and something sharper, alcohol, filling the small car. As Abby pulled away from the curb, the conversation started normal enough. The man introduced himself as Jason. He asked about their night, complimented Abby's taste in movies. His words tumbled out fast, too friendly, tinged with a nervous energy. Lindsay watched him in the rearview mirror, noticing the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, the way his hand clenched and unclenched in his lap. Abby, ever the optimist, tried to carry on as normal, but her laughter sounded thinner now, strained at the edges. The roads grew emptier as they drove, streetlights giving way to long, dark stretches lined with thick stands of trees and cornfields waving in the breeze. Jason's directions grew more confusing, more insistent, until it was clear they were no longer headed toward any familiar neighborhood. Lindsay's hands tightened on her lap. The car's engine hummed, the only constant in a night that suddenly felt like it was unraveling. Far behind them, the lights of the town faded into darkness, and ahead, just out of reach, was the shadowy unknown, where the warm promise of summer could vanish in an instant, and innocence might be lost forever. The silence inside the car felt heavier with each passing block, as though the outside world had faded away, leaving just the three of them adrift in their own uneasy universe. The man who called himself Jason sat hunched in the back seat, his hands hidden in the shadows, his presence somehow both too large and too quiet for the small, battered sedan. Abby gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale beneath the flickering dashboard light. Lindsay stared straight ahead, hyper-aware of every sound, the rhythmic thump of tires against seams in the old country road, the soft click of Jason's nails against the plastic door handle, the faint metallic clink of something heavy in his jacket pocket. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and was answered only by the rush of wind through open windows. Jason had said his place was just a few blocks away, but each minute seemed to stretch further, every turn taking them away from the comfort of streetlights and deeper into the dim outskirts of Dover. He pointed out directions, left at the railroad crossing, right at the dirt lane lined with weeping willows. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Abby tried to keep up, nodding at every instruction, but it was obvious to Lindsay that these weren't roads they knew. The landmarks became less familiar, the homes spaced farther apart, the landscape turning to thickets and shadow. The air in the car grew thick and sour, the scent of sweat and cheap cologne mixing with the ghostly sweetness of wild honeysuckle growing along the roadside. Lindsay's heart hammered so loudly she wondered if Jason could hear it. She told herself to be calm, to focus on Abby, to look for an escape. The possibility that something was wrong pressed closer, cold and persistent. Trying to lighten the mood, Abby commented on the old barns and silos blurring by outside, but her voice lacked its usual cheer. Jason chuckled, low, almost amused, as if he knew exactly how they were feeling. He reached into his pocket and fished out a crumpled bill, offering it up front. "For your trouble," he said, voice gruff but polite, as if paying for their time made everything all right. Abby smiled tightly, said it was no big deal, but made no move to take the money. The road narrowed to a single lane. The pavement cracked and overgrown at the edges. Tall trees closed in overhead, branches arching together like a tunnel leading deeper into darkness. The headlights seemed weaker here, swallowed by the woods. Lindsay glanced at Abby, eyes pleading, but Abby's attention was fixed on the road, hands trembling ever so slightly on the wheel. Jason's tone changed. His friendliness slipped away, replaced by an edge of impatience. "Take this next left," he said, voice sharper now. The words came out as a command, not a request. Abby hesitated, slowing as the car approached a narrow dirt turnoff, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, roots and stones jutting up through the packed earth. She pulled in, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The car shuddered as it bumped along the uneven path, trees pressing close on either side. Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. She scanned the woods for a house, any sign of life, but there was nothing. Just darkness, shadows, and the echo of her own fear. In the rearview mirror, Jason watched them both, his face obscured but his eyes reflecting the faint glimmer of headlights. Suddenly, he leaned forward, voice low and urgent. "Stop here." The command brooked no argument. Abby eased the car to a halt, engine idling, headlights pointing into a tangle of undergrowth and wild grass. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the ticking of the engine cooling, the chirr of night insects, the ragged breathing inside the car. Jason shifted, the motion oddly deliberate, and Abby stiffened. Lindsay's pulse spiked. This was wrong, all of it. The sense of threat became almost tangible. The world outside their windows was pitch black, the thick woods swallowing any sign of safety. He produced another crumpled bill, thrusting it forward again. Abby shook her head, more insistent this time. "We're fine, really. Where's your house?" But the question went unanswered. Instead, Jason's posture shifted, his hands resting casually at his sides, eyes flicking from Lindsay to Abby and back. He started talking, fast, voice almost manic, about losing his wallet, about a fight with his brother, about how no one in this town ever helped him. The stories tripped over themselves, details not quite adding up. His tone flipped from friendly to angry and back again, as if testing how far he could push before they protested. Abby managed a nervous laugh, but Lindsay could feel her friend's panic building beneath the surface, held back only by the desperate need to keep things calm. Then, abruptly, Jason snapped. The mask of civility fell away, replaced by a cold, unnerving focus. His words turned threatening. He told them to shut off the engine, to keep quiet, to hand over their phones. The reality of danger finally broke through the last layer of denial. Abby obeyed without a word, turning the key with shaking hands, plunging them into darkness. In that moment, every instinct screamed for escape, but the night seemed to close in, offering no refuge. Lindsay's eyes darted to the woods, searching for a path, a break in the trees, any hope of running. But Jason's presence filled the small space, menacing, unpredictable, and terrifyingly in control. He leaned forward, voice a harsh whisper, "You're going to do exactly what I say." His breath was hot, sour with drink, and for the first time, Lindsay saw the true danger in his eyes, a hollow, desperate hunger that cared nothing for their pleas or their fear. As the wind rustled the branches outside and the darkness pressed closer, the safe, familiar world they'd always known seemed impossibly far away. All that remained was the stranger in their car, and the chilling certainty that their night was only just beginning. The night pressed in on them like a suffocating blanket, the silence inside the car growing thicker, heavier, until it felt like another presence entirely. The woods outside seemed endless, a tangle of shadows and shifting branches, the air cold and damp despite the summer heat. Time slowed, seconds dragging out as Abby and Lindsay tried to process the nightmare that had slipped into their ordinary lives. Jason's change in demeanor was total, abrupt, and absolute. Gone was the desperate man begging for a ride, replaced by someone cold and methodical, his intentions unmistakable. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a glinting blade, its edge catching what little light seeped in through the windshield. Abby's breath stuttered. Lindsay's hands went numb, the blood draining from her fingers as a chill worked its way down her spine. "Drive," Jason ordered, the word coming out low and sharp, slicing through the thick silence. Abby didn't dare protest. Her hands shook as she started the engine again, headlights sweeping over the dense undergrowth and scattered rocks that lined the dirt track. The car crept forward, wheels crunching over stones, every jolt sending a spike of fear through the girls. Jason pressed the knife against the back of Lindsay's seat, the silent threat unmistakable. Lindsay kept her gaze fixed on the dashboard, her mind racing through frantic possibilities. Maybe there would be a passing car. Maybe a house with a porch light burning in the distance. Maybe this nightmare would end if she just stayed calm. But as the sedan rolled deeper into the woods, it became painfully clear that no help was coming. The night belonged to Jason now, and every inch they drove was another step away from safety. Jason's voice, no longer masking his intentions, barked orders at them. He told Abby where to turn, his directions leading them further from the main road, the trees thickening until the headlights barely cut through the gloom. Lindsay tried to memorize landmarks, a crooked birch, a rusted mailbox, the shape of a fallen log, but it all blurred together, every shadow a threat, every clearing a trap. Suddenly, Jason ordered Abby to stop. The car lurched to a halt beside a break in the woods, where a narrow path wound down toward the river, invisible in the darkness, but close enough that Lindsay could hear water moving beyond the trees. Jason's breathing was heavy, erratic, his hand trembling ever so slightly as he pressed the knife into view. He demanded that Lindsay turn and face him, then tossed a pair of shoelaces at her feet. "Tie her hands," he growled, gesturing to Abby. Lindsay's world shrank to the space between her and her best friend. She fumbled for the laces, fingers shaking so badly she nearly dropped them, the enormity of the situation settling over her like a crushing weight. Abby met her eyes, terrified, desperate, but trying to be brave. Tears shimmered in the corners of Lindsay's vision as she looped the laces around Abby's wrists, her apologies silent and choked by fear. Jason watched, lips pressed into a tight line, knife never leaving his grip. He yanked the back door open and grabbed Abby by the arm, pulling her from the car with brutal efficiency. Lindsay's heart hammered as she watched her friend stumble, hands bound, her cries muffled by the thick night air. Jason shoved Abby ahead of him, down the narrow path into the trees. For a moment, Lindsay was frozen, paralyzed by terror, shame, and guilt. Then Jason turned, fixing her with a cold glare. "Get out!" he barked. She obeyed, legs unsteady as she followed the uneven path. The sounds of the river grew louder, mingling with the crunch of twigs beneath their feet, and Abby's stifled sobs. The world beyond the tree line felt like another planet. The moon hung low and bright, casting ghostly light over the tangled undergrowth and the winding river just beyond sight. Lindsay's senses sharpened with adrenaline. Every breath of damp, earthy air, every sharp edge of bark beneath her palm as she stumbled forward, every shadow seeming to shift and move. At the edge of a small clearing, Jason stopped. He shoved Abby to her knees and turned to Lindsay, forcing her to stand back, to watch. The blade flashed again as he leaned close to Abby, his words a torrent of threats and curses, spit flying from his mouth in a feverish rage. Abby begged for her life, voice choked and broken, her courage finally crumbling beneath the reality of what was happening. Jason barely seemed to hear her. Lindsay's thoughts fractured, helpless and frantic. She tried to look away, tried to block out the horror, but Jason made sure she saw every moment, every strike, every drop of blood, every gasp that tore itself from Abby's throat. The forest swallowed their cries, the river running on oblivious to the violence beneath its banks. When it was done, Abby collapsed onto the ground, her body limp, breath rattling in the silence. Lindsay screamed, an inhuman, desperate sound, only to have Jason turn on her, the knife now streaked with Abby's blood. He advanced, grabbing Lindsay by the throat, squeezing with hands that shook from rage and adrenaline. The world narrowed to the crushing pain in her neck, the burning in her lungs, the world fading at the edges as her vision blurred. With the last ounce of willpower, Lindsay went limp, forcing her body to relax, to play dead as Jason's grip tightened, then loosened. She let herself slump to the ground, heart thundering, mind clinging to a sliver of hope that this act might save her life. Jason let go, muttering to himself, convinced she was finished. The woods swallowed him as he stumbled back toward the river, leaving Lindsay crumpled in the dirt, surrounded by silence and the memory of the friend she couldn't save. Time seemed to break apart in that small clearing, each moment stretching into eternity as Lindsay lay motionless on the cold, damp earth, senses sharpened to every sound and movement. The world around her became a blur of shadows and moonlight, the woods impossibly silent except for the faint, sickening noise of Jason's ragged breath and the distant rush of the river. Abby's body was crumpled nearby, her hands still bound with the shoelaces Lindsay had tied. Her head turned at an unnatural angle, long hair dark with blood and mud. The horror of it settled over Lindsay like a crushing weight. Guilt, terror, and disbelief warring for space inside her chest. She wanted to scream, to fight, to somehow undo the last half hour and pull Abby away from danger, but her limbs refused to move, and her mind circled in a numb, hopeless daze. Jason loomed over Abby, his figure thrown into monstrous relief by the moon. The blade in his hand caught the weak silver light, every motion grotesque and deliberate. He spat curses, his voice raw and broken by something wild and irredeemable. The violence he unleashed was frenzied and relentless, stabbing again and again at Abby's neck and chest, each movement sending another spray of blood onto the undergrowth, soaking the roots, painting leaves with a horror that seemed impossible in this quiet, ordinary place. Lindsay's breath grew shallow, her chest heaving as she tried to stay limp, tried not to make a sound that would draw his attention back to her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but terror anchored her body, rooting her to the spot. She listened to Abby's gasps grow weaker, watched her friend's legs twitch in the final helpless reflexes of life ebbing away. The nightmare felt endless, a loop of suffering that the woods alone would ever witness. When it was over, the woods were so silent, Lindsay could hear the desperate pounding of her own heart. Jason staggered back, his chest heaving, hands and knife slick with blood. He cursed the night, the world, maybe even himself. For a moment, he just stood there, shoulders rising and falling, eyes wild and empty as he looked down at what he had done. Then, abruptly, he turned his attention to Lindsay. He advanced on her, boots squelching in the soft mud. Every step felt like the ground itself might swallow him, but still he came, the blade glinting. Lindsay's body remained limp, her mind locked in the desperate hope that if she looked lifeless, maybe he would leave her be. But Jason was a man driven by panic as much as violence, and he reached down, seizing Lindsay by the shoulders and dragging her deeper into the thicket. Twigs scraped her arms, sharp stones dug into her hip, but she dared not react. Jason's grip was merciless as he hauled her to her knees, his free hand snaking around her throat. The world tunneled into a blur of heat and darkness, her vision closing in as his fingers squeezed tighter. The pressure built, each heartbeat a thunderclap, each second another edge of black creeping in from the sides of her vision. Lindsay's mind clawed for something, an escape, a memory, a reason not to give up. But her body began to falter, lungs burning, strength waning. With a final, desperate calculation, Lindsay let herself go slack. She loosened her muscles, let her head loll to the side, eyes rolling up. Jason's grip paused, uncertain. He gave her a rough shake, muttering to himself, testing to see if she would move. She didn't. After what felt like forever, his hands left her neck, the blade retreating. He let her fall to the dirt, her face pressed to the cool earth, the scent of blood and wet leaves filling her nostrils. She listened as Jason stumbled away, his breathing ragged and uneven, feet crashing through the underbrush as he moved back toward the river. He muttered curses, incoherent words drifting back on the wind, then the snap of a branch as he disappeared into the night. Lindsay didn't dare move, didn't even blink. Until the woods were quiet once more, and the only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart. The pain in her throat was blinding, each breath a rasp. But she was alive somehow. Alive while Abby lay still and silent, gone forever. Grief threatened to break through her numbness, but fear kept it at bay, forcing her to listen, to wait, to make absolutely sure Jason was gone. Only when she was certain did she let herself stir, rolling onto her side and pressing her palm to the earth for balance. Her entire body trembled as she crawled toward Abby, the movement slow, excruciating. She reached out, touching Abby's shoulder, willing her to move, to open her eyes, to prove this was just a nightmare that could be woken from. But there was no response, no breath, no sign of life. The shoelaces still bound Abby's wrists, stained dark with her own blood. Lindsay choked on a sob, the horror settling over her with inescapable finality. In the pale light, the forest floor was a mosaic of blood, torn grass, and scattered strands of shoelaces. Lindsay's own hands shook as she tried to free Abby, but her friend was far beyond help. The river murmured on, its current uncaring, its waters reflecting a sky that seemed indifferent to tragedy. Lindsay looked up, the branches overhead swaying in the gentle wind as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The world she had known, safe, small, predictable, was gone. All that remained was the darkness, the terror, and the brutal reality that she was alone. For a long while after Jason disappeared into the tangled darkness, Lindsay stayed absolutely still, pressed to the muddy ground, barely daring to breathe. Every nerve was raw with terror, her throat throbbed from his crushing grip, and her body trembled with the shock of what she had seen. The forest was alive with the sounds of night, but every crack of a twig, every flutter of wings sent fresh jolts of panic through her system. The scent of blood and cold river water clung to her, sickening and impossible to escape. She lay like that, silent, motionless, eyes wide open, for what felt like forever. Time stretched, elastic and meaningless. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps coming back, Jason's voice cursing in the dark, the snap of branches under boots. Sometimes it was only her heart pounding in her ears, her body bracing for a pain that, somehow, never came. Gradually, as the minutes dragged on and the forest's edge grew quieter, Lindsay dared to believe she might be alone. At first, she only twitched her fingers, testing for movement. Her limbs were weak, her throat burned with every swallow, and her head throbbed with the aftershocks of terror. But the will to survive, raw and primal, rose inside her. She rolled slowly onto her stomach, every joint screaming in protest, and looked back toward Abby's motionless form. For a moment, she wished she could stay, that she could curl beside her best friend and will her back to life. But somewhere, deep inside, Lindsay knew she couldn't stay. If she didn't move, if she didn't get help, Abby's death would go unanswered, and she herself would die out here, just another shadow among the trees. The first challenge was standing. Her legs wobbled beneath her, the earth cold and slick with dew and blood. She pushed herself upright, fighting back waves of dizziness, clinging to the trunk of a tree for balance. Her breath rattled painfully, but she was moving. That was all that mattered. Her shoes were soaked through, her jeans smeared with mud and stains she didn't want to examine. Every inch of her body ached. Still, she forced herself forward, stumbling in the direction she hoped would lead her back to the road. The river's distant rush was her only guide, the sound pulling her away from the sight of so much horror. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and fear. More than once she fell, scraping her palms and knees, but she pushed on, driven by the desperate need to survive. At some point, the darkness began to pale, a faint, bluish glow creeping through the canopy above. Lindsay's sense of time was shattered. She didn't know how long she'd wandered through the woods, but the promise of morning brought with it a fragile hope. If she could just reach the road, if she could find another soul awake at this hour, maybe someone would help. Maybe, just maybe, she could bring justice for Abby. Her mind replayed everything in a dizzying, endless loop. Abby's laughter at the mall, her brave face in the car, the sickening terror in her eyes in those final moments. Lindsay's guilt was a living thing, gnawing at her insides, but she pushed it away. There would be time for grief later. Now was the time for survival. As she staggered through the brush, tree branches whipped at her face and arms, their scratches stinging but oddly reassuring. They reminded her she was still alive, still capable of feeling pain. She didn't dare call out, afraid Jason might still be somewhere nearby, watching, waiting. So she moved in silence, each step a victory, each breath a defiance. Her shoelaces, those same laces she'd tied around Abby's wrists, still dangled uselessly from her hands. At some point, she worked them free, tucking them in her pocket, determined to keep moving. When she finally glimpsed the faint glimmer of headlights through the trees, it took her a moment to believe it was real. She blinked, vision swimming, and staggered toward the light with every last scrap of strength she had. The world beyond the woods was blinding in its ordinariness. A two-lane country road, gravel shoulders, weeds swaying in the morning breeze. Lindsay half fell, half crawled from the trees, waving her arms weakly as a distant vehicle approached. The engine's rumble grew louder, filling her with panic and hope all at once. Would they stop? Would they see her? She stumbled to the edge of the pavement, collapsed to her knees, and raised a trembling arm. The truck, an old blue Ford caked in dust, squealed to a halt yards away. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a farmer's tan, threw open his door and ran toward her, cursing in shock at the sight of her battered face and bloodied clothes. His words tumbled over each other, concern and confusion and fear. Lindsay tried to answer, but only a croak came out, her voice barely a whisper. She pointed back toward the woods, tears streaming down her cheeks as relief finally broke through the terror. The man wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, his hands gentle but trembling. He pulled a cell phone from his pocket and called 911, voice rough with urgency. Lindsay clung to his presence. The warmth of another human being, a lifeline she hadn't dared hope for. Sirens echoed distantly, growing louder as the dawn broke full across the landscape. The world she thought she'd lost, safety, help, the chance for justice, had found her, battered but alive, on the edge of that lonely country road. The truck driver stayed with her, muttering reassurances, his shadow a shield against the nightmares still lurking just beyond the tree line. Lindsay curled into herself, exhaustion and shock taking hold, but she knew she'd done the impossible. She'd survived. Somehow, she'd escaped the woods, carrying Abby's story with her into the light of a new day. The world outside was awash in the pale light of dawn by the time police descended on the edge of the woods, their cruisers splashing red and blue across the fields and country roads. The sleepy town of Dover, so used to ordinary mornings, awoke to the unfamiliar sound of sirens and the heavy tread of boots through dewy grass. Officers fanned out, eyes scanning the tangled undergrowth for any sign of the horror Lindsay had described with shaking hands and a hoarse, broken voice. The paramedics whisked Lindsay away to the ambulance, their hands gentle but hurried as they checked her vitals, swaddled her in a blanket, and tried to coax words out of her swollen, bruised throat. She drifted in and out of awareness, shock cocooning her from the worst of what she'd witnessed. As the doors of the ambulance swung shut, she caught one last glimpse of the woods, the shadows beneath the trees now forever marked by what had happened there. The smell of river mud and blood lingered in her senses, making it impossible to tell if she was awake or still trapped in a nightmare. For the searchers, officers, a pair of state troopers, and the county sheriff, the scene was unlike anything they'd known in quiet Dover. Dew soaked their boots, and the sun cast long, haunting shadows across the ground. They moved slowly, careful not to disturb potential evidence. A hush settled over the group as they entered the woods, guided by Lindsay's fractured directions and the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, the nightmare could still be undone. It didn't take long for them to find Abby. She lay crumpled near the riverbank, shoelaces still tangled tight around her slender wrists. the front of her shirt dark and stiff with blood. The soft earth beneath her was stained, the grass trampled and torn. Her face was turned toward the water, eyes closed as if dreaming. For a moment, the searchers froze, caught between the horror of the scene and the aching innocence of the girl before them. The sheriff knelt beside her, his expression hardening with every detail he took in. The wounds, the bindings, the evidence of a life stolen in violence. Detectives swept the area, collecting what they could. The muddy ground held the prints of at least 3 sets of shoes. Lindsay's small, desperate tracks zigzagging away from the scene. Abby's stumbling steps, and larger, heavier prints, pressed deep and erratic, circling like a predator. A bloody knife, its handle slick, lay a few feet from Abby's body, half buried in wet leaves and dirt. The blade was pitted and old, the kind you'd find in a kitchen drawer or a hunting shed. Shoelaces, one torn, the other stretched to its limit, were scattered nearby, tangled in weeds and mud. One officer spotted a scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn bush, dark with blood, possibly torn from Jason's sleeve in his frantic escape. Another found Abby's camera, miraculously intact, but splattered with mud, its film still inside. Each discovery was documented, photographed, and carefully bagged as the sun crept higher and the weight of tragedy settled heavier on every heart. The evidence painted a brutal, senseless story. The crime scene tape went up, neon yellow cutting through the green. A state forensic team arrived, setting up floodlights and tents, their white suits ghost-like in the soft morning. The forest floor became a patchwork of numbered markers, each footprint, each blood droplet, every sign of struggle preserved for later. A stray earring glinted in the mud, a memory of a girl who had started her evening with plans for popcorn and movies, not knowing her night would end in the cold silence of the woods. Reporters began to gather at the edge of the road, word spreading faster than the morning breeze. Families peered from their front porches, children kept indoors, whispers blooming across the neighborhood. This sort of violence was alien to Dover, unthinkable, a rupture in the fabric of the town's quiet routine. The sheriff's deputies fielded calls from worried parents, their faces grim, voices low. As the hours passed, more details emerged. Lindsay, wrapped in blankets at the hospital, told her story as best she could, her memory fragmented but desperate to help. She described Jason's face, the rough beard, the nervous energy, the tattoo she glimpsed on his arm, and the sharp tang of alcohol on his breath. Each word brought the police closer to the truth, but also drove home the senselessness of the loss. The officers pressed her gently for details, anything that might help. But even as she spoke, it was clear that some scars would never heal. Abby's parents arrived at the scene, their grief uncontainable, breaking the last remnants of morning calm. Neighbors offered hugs, casseroles, words that meant nothing in the face of what had happened. The entire town mourned, united in sorrow and fear, their hearts shattered for a girl whose life had been stolen, for a friend who had survived but would never truly escape the darkness of that night. By the end of the day, the woods stood quiet again, the evidence bagged, the body removed, the crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze. Yet beneath the silence, something had shifted in Dover. Shadows lingered longer at the edges of the trees, and the river's song carried a note of grief that hadn't been there before. What had once been just another summer morning was now forever marked by the memory of Abby Miller, by the footprints and bloodstains, and by the fragile, indomitable will of a girl who'd somehow found her way out of the nightmare alive. The days after the murder seemed to crawl and blur all at once, a haze of grief and questions settling over Dover. News of Abby's death and Lindsay's miraculous survival moved through the town like a storm, uprooting all sense of safety. For those who had only known Dover as a place where nothing truly bad ever happened, the reality was almost too much to bear. Porch lights burned late into the night. Parents held their children a little tighter, and nobody let strangers anywhere near their cars. Lindsay woke in the hospital with a tangle of wires and bandages, her world reduced to a single room smelling of antiseptic and flowers. Pain radiated from her throat with every swallow, and her limbs ached with the aftershocks of trauma. Sleep brought only nightmares. Even in waking moments, flashes of memory assaulted her. Abby's terrified face, Jason's knife, the cold press of dirt under her cheek. Nurses came and went, speaking in gentle tones, offering food and pills that she barely noticed. Her parents stayed at her bedside, their worry painted in every glance and whispered conversation. The police came next, detectives in wrinkled shirts and tired eyes, their notepads filling with scribbled details as Lindsay struggled to recall every moment. She described the stranger in the car. His name, Jason, or so he'd said. His unkempt hair, the rough tattoo she'd glimpsed on his forearm, the overwhelming smell of alcohol and sweat. She remembered his stories, the way his voice changed from friendly to threatening in a heartbeat, and the way his hand never left the knife until it was all over. Fragments came back in fits and starts. She recalled the sound of gravel crunching beneath tires, the way Jason had barked orders, the dizzy terror when Abby was dragged from the car. Sometimes her memory faltered, blurring in the darkest moments, but always she forced herself to continue, desperate to give the police something, anything, that could bring justice for Abby. Meanwhile, the investigation consumed the town. Detectives flooded the hospital and the scene in the woods, collecting evidence, interviewing anyone who might have seen a stranger near the mall or along the road that night. Police sketches circulated. A man with hollow eyes and a scruffy beard, lines deepened by anger and desperation. Tips poured in from neighboring towns, each one kindling a brief, flickering hope that quickly sputtered out as suspects were questioned and released. The officers worked around the clock, chasing down every lead. One remembered an odd car parked near the river the week before. Another a man matching Jason's description asking for change at a gas station. Patrols doubled in neighborhoods and along back roads, searching for a sign, a footprint, a scrap of fabric, a cigarette butt still warm. But Jason was a shadow, slipping through their grasp, always a step ahead. In the hospital, Lindsay's world shrank to the routine of recovery. She endured questions from detectives and doctors, therapists and well-meaning relatives. She tried to find strength in their encouragement, but mostly she just felt empty. Grief was a constant, her thoughts haunted by Abby's absence, her guilt a heavy stone lodged in her chest. She played over every moment, the drive, the encounter, the desperate final minutes by the river. If only she had said no, had insisted they drive away, had never let Jason into their car. The town rallied around her and Abby's family in those first days. Vigils were held on the high school lawn, candles flickering in the summer wind. Friends brought casseroles and cards. Neighbors left bouquets on the miller's porch. Teachers offered hugs and platitudes. The community's sorrow was deep and real, but it couldn't touch the rawness inside Lindsay or the horror that replayed behind her closed eyes. For the detectives, the challenge was immense. Lindsay was the only direct witness, her testimony critical but fragmented by trauma. Still, her recollection of the name Jason, the tattoo, and his rough features became the backbone of the search. Sketch artists worked from her shaky descriptions, producing posters distributed to every police station and convenience store for miles. In the weeks that followed, every dead end felt like another failure. The police chased rumors of men passing through town, combed through criminal records, checked shelters, and even searched the banks of the river for discarded evidence. But each time they thought they were close, the lead dissolved. Wrong man, wrong tattoo, a name that didn't match. The sense of frustration grew. The town's sorrow began to shift into anger and fear. At night, Lindsay lay awake, the hospital's glow leaking in around the curtains, unable to escape the sense that Jason was still out there. She wondered if she would ever truly feel safe again. In the end, all that was left were fragments. The sound of Jason's voice, to the burning grip of his hands, the memory of Abby's last, terrified glance. Lindsay did what she could to help, clinging to every detail, but the investigation stalled. The killer vanished into the shadows of Dover and beyond, leaving a small town forever changed, and a survivor who would spend years haunted by a summer night that should have been nothing more than a memory. As the first weeks faded into months, the relentless search for Jason Harlan lost momentum, the initial shock in Dover settling into a dull, aching void. The story that once dominated headlines and dinner conversations slowly retreated from the front pages, replaced by other news, other worries. For the people who loved Abby Miller, though, time offered no such mercy. The police file thickened with every passing week. Interviews, tips, sketches, even vague sightings of men who looked like the suspect, each one ending in disappointment. The bloody knife, the shoe prints, and the scattered shoelaces sat in evidence lockers, stark reminders of a night no one could forget. Despite the urgency, nothing conclusive emerged. DNA from the crime scene was sent to every database the state could access, but the technology wasn't enough. No matches. No answers. Detectives stopped by Lindsay's house less often now, their questions trailing off, their voices quieter and tinged with frustration. Lindsay, still recovering from her injuries and trauma, felt herself growing numb. The world outside her window carried on as if nothing had happened. Kids played in sprinklers, the river flowed beneath the bridge, and the grocery store carried the same stacks of glossy magazines and soda bottles. Yet for Lindsay, everything felt foreign, each day shadowed by a sense of absence and unreality. Nighttime was the hardest. Sleep became a battleground, her dreams haunted by fragments of memory, the cold grip of Jason's hands, Abby's voice echoing in the trees, the blinding panic in the moonlit woods. She tried to find comfort in routine, school assignments, movies on mute, long walks by the river, but the past clung to her like a second skin. Even sunlight couldn't quite chase away the feeling that someone might be watching from behind a tree or passing by in a stranger's car. Abby's parents rarely left their house. They answered the phone in hushed tones, turned away casseroles and condolences with watery smiles, and kept Abby's room untouched. Her art projects, sketches of local places, homemade birthday cards, half-finished poems, remained taped to her wall. Sometimes her mother would stand in the doorway, fingers resting on the frame, as if waiting for Abby to return at any moment. Friends left flowers beneath her window. Classmates slipped notes and drawings through the mail slot. Small attempts at comfort that never quite reached the hollow center of their grief. The town itself wore new scars. people became more suspicious, more guarded. The memory of that summer night grew into a cautionary tale for a new generation. Parents repeating warnings about strangers, teens looking twice at anyone who didn't seem to belong. Porch lights burned longer. Doors were locked a little earlier. Some folks even kept guns by their beds, habits that would linger long after the story faded from memory. But for Lindsay, the scars ran deepest of all. She spent hours in therapy, her sessions a swirl of halting confessions and flashbacks. The therapist's office was filled with soothing colors, soft music, and comforting words that never seemed to reach the root of her fear. Lindsay wanted to believe she could get better, that one day she'd laugh the way she used to, that she'd remember Abby with joy instead of pain. But each attempt at moving on felt like betrayal, leaving her best friend behind in the shadows, alone and unavenged. She wrote letters to Abby that she never sent, filling notebooks with memories and apologies, trying to make sense of what had happened. Some nights, she wandered to the edge of the woods, standing just out of sight of the river, willing herself to step forward, but always turning back at the last second. The trees seemed to whisper, holding the truth of that night in their leaves and roots. The case, once the center of everything, became a cold shadow in the background, a file on a detective's desk, a faded poster in the police station, a question people only asked in hushed tones if they thought Lindsay wasn't listening. The world did not stop, even for tragedy. At school, Lindsay was both invisible and infamous. Some classmates avoided her, unable to meet her eyes. Others whispered stories in hallways, inventing rumors and explanations as a way to make sense of the incomprehensible. Teachers offered gentle encouragement, but the lessons felt meaningless, washed out by grief. Her friendships changed, some growing distant, others brittle and sharp. The past, it seemed, wouldn't let her move forward, or let anyone forget. As the seasons changed, the woods where Abby died grew thick with wildflowers, then burst into autumn color, then stood stark and bare beneath winter snow. Lindsay marked the passage of time in small rituals, lighting a candle for Abby on the first of every month, keeping a pressed daisy in her diary, refusing to walk home alone even in broad daylight. She did not forget. She could not. There were moments, sunlit mornings, soft laughter with a sibling, the rush of the river after heavy rain, when hope tried to take root again. But always, just beneath the surface, was the knowledge that Abby's killer remained at large. Jason had vanished like smoke, leaving only trauma and questions behind. The town learned to live with uncertainty, to bury their fear under routine, to hope that one day the silence would be broken by justice. But for now, there was only the cold shadow of a case grown quiet, a survivor learning to bear the weight of memory, and a community haunted by what had been lost one ordinary summer night. Years slipped by in Dover, the town returning to its routines on the surface, yet never quite recovering from the trauma of that fateful night. Abby's face lived on in fading yearbook photos and the hearts of those who loved her. Lindsay grew older, carrying invisible scars and searching for meaning in what she'd survived. Some nights she would still awaken, heart pounding, the phantom smell of river mud and blood lingering on the air. She finished high school, moved away for college, then drifted through her 20s, haunted and changed. Justice, it seemed, had been lost to the silence and the shadows of the woods. Yet, while life moved on, science did not stand still. It began quietly, just another file among thousands. In a climate-controlled lab hundreds of miles from Dover, technicians pored over evidence boxes with latex gloves and bright lights. Old DNA samples, once deemed too degraded, too contaminated to be useful, were re-examined using new technology. What was once invisible became clear. Abby's case, stamped, cold, pending, came up for review on a random rotation. The bloody knife, the shoelaces, the tangled clump of hair from the crime scene. They all yielded fragments, each whispering the same truth. One by one, old cold cases across Ohio found their way back into the light. Abby's was just one, but to Lindsay, it was everything. It started with a phone call she never expected. Lindsay, now living in a different state, working at a quiet library, received a message from a detective whose name she didn't recognize. For a moment, her chest tightened, dread and hope crashing together. She called back, voice trembling. The detective's words changed the course of her life all over again. There was a new match, an unexpected connection. Decades after that night, DNA from the crime scene had been run through national databases and hit on a new profile. The result was chilling, and so was the story behind it. The suspect's name was different, but the face was the same. The man she had always known as Jason Harlan was, in fact, a drifter who'd traveled through Ohio, picking up odd jobs and sometimes running afoul of the law. He'd been arrested in another state for a separate crime. During the booking process, his DNA was collected, cataloged, and quietly filed away. It was only when a family member, tormented by suspicion, guilt, and long-held secrets, came forward that the final connection was made. The family had heard stories, noticed patterns, and finally, after years of silence, tipped off authorities. The DNA match, combined with Lindsay's testimony and the mountain of evidence that had been carefully preserved, closed the gap. The man, whose true name was revealed in the investigation, was tracked, found, and arrested without incident. Lindsay sat in a courtroom years later, the weight of time pressing on her shoulders as she watched him enter in handcuffs and a faded jumpsuit. He looked older, softer around the edges, but his eyes were the same, cold, hungry, forever etched in her nightmares. The trial dredged up every memory she'd spent so long trying to bury. She listened to experts describe the new forensic techniques that had finally made the match possible. She heard the prosecutors lay out the timeline, the evidence, the wounds. She saw Abby's parents sit side by side, their hands clasped tightly, decades of grief and anger written on their faces. The defense tried to argue mistaken identity, tried to pick holes in the evidence, but the science was irrefutable. The jury heard Lindsay's voice, steady if trembling, describe the stranger, the tattoo, the panic, the knife. Other women came forward too, telling stories of close calls, suspicious encounters, near misses in small towns across Ohio and beyond. It painted a portrait of a man who had evaded justice for far too long. At last, the verdict came. Guilty. The judge handed down a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. 96.5 years, a number as heavy as it was precise. Lindsay felt an odd mixture of relief and sorrow. No verdict, no sentence could undo what was lost, could return Abby or erase the scars. But as she stepped outside the courthouse into the afternoon sun, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, a fragile sense of peace. News of the conviction swept through Dover and beyond. People who had nearly forgotten the old headlines read the updates with a mixture of shock and catharsis. The Miller family, while never whole again, found a new way to grieve, now with answers, now with the truth acknowledged. The town, too, exhaled. The lingering fear and rumors finally settled. It did not mean life returned to what it had been. For Lindsay, healing was an ongoing journey. Sometimes she spoke about Abby at school assemblies or victim advocacy groups, telling the truth of that night and the years of uncertainty that followed. Sometimes, when she returned to Dover to visit her parents, she'd leave a single flower by the riverbank. The water's song a little softer, less haunted. The story of Abby Miller and the friend who survived became more than a cautionary tale. It became a testament to persistence, to science, to the courage it takes to remember and to keep hoping. And somewhere in the archives of cold cases across the country, a new note was added. Solved. Time never truly healed the wounds left in Dover, Ohio. The conviction brought closure, but not a return to innocence. Life, as it does, moved forward with its usual stubbornness, but the edges of the world felt forever changed for those who had known Abby Miller, for those who had witnessed firsthand the ripples of violence that a single summer night could unleash. For Lindsay, the journey after the trial was not one of forgetting, but of learning to live alongside memory. The nightmares grew less frequent, but when they came, they were still vivid. The cool press of mud, the suffocating dark, Abby's voice carried by the wind through the trees. Therapy helped, as did time, but it was the act of remembering, the determination not to let Abby's story slip away, that gave her the greatest sense of purpose. She spoke at events and schools, never with a flourish or theatrics, but with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who had survived. She wanted young people, especially girls, to understand the weight of choices, the danger that sometimes hides behind a stranger's smile, and the importance of listening to your own unease. She told them about that night, about how she and Abby had believed in the safety of small towns, the goodness of helping others, the impossibility of tragedy. She spoke about the split-second decision to unlock the car doors, the feeling of helplessness as the night unraveled, and the long years when hope felt like an act of defiance. She described Abby's courage, her loyalty, and the way her laughter had filled every empty space. She talked about the pain of survival, of carrying the burden of being the one left behind, and the guilt that never quite disappeared. Sometimes Lindsay would stand at the riverbank where it had all ended, watching the water move swiftly past the tangled roots and rocks. She thought of Abby's art, the sketches left behind, the bright colors, the hopefulness in each unfinished line. Lindsay kept one of Abby's paintings above her desk, a field of sunflowers swaying beneath a summer sky. It reminded her that beauty and darkness could exist in the same world, that even in the shadow of loss, life could still reach for the sun. The Miller family learned to live with their grief, growing quieter, but not broken. Abby's mother kept her daughter's room as it was, dusting the shelves, straightening the covers, sometimes speaking aloud, as if Abby might round the corner at any moment. Her father planted a garden in Abby's honor, wildflowers and roses spilling over the fence by midsummer, a riot of color against the green. Neighbors helped tend the blooms, their hands gentle, their conversations filled with long silences and careful kindness. There were anniversaries, both private and public, a memorial at the high school, a scholarship in Abby's name, a gathering by the river every June where friends and family released lanterns that floated across the water, carrying messages of love and longing into the twilight. Dover changed, as all places do after tragedy. People became a little more careful, a little more aware of the world's dangers, but also a little more grateful for ordinary joys. Children learned to trust their instincts. Parents drove a few extra blocks to pick up their kids. The lessons were hard-won, the cost unimaginably high, but the community carried them forward. The case itself became something larger than a single crime. Reporters wrote about the cold case breakthrough, about the power of DNA technology, and the dogged persistence of investigators who never gave up. True crime podcasts and documentaries retold the story, drawing attention to the reality that justice can come late, but the need for answers never fades. Lindsay sometimes listened to these retellings, her feelings a mix of pride and sorrow. She wanted Abby remembered for her spirit, not just her tragedy, for the way she lived, not only for how she died. There were moments of healing, shared laughter with old friends, the comfort of a late-night phone call, the discovery of a forgotten photograph that made her smile through her tears. Lindsay married and started a family of her own, always teaching her children to be kind, to be brave, and never to take safety for granted. The scars she carried didn't disappear, but in time they became a map, a testament to her resilience, her survival, and the enduring bonds of love and friendship. One summer evening, years after the trial, Lindsay stood by the river with her daughter. Fireflies danced above the water, and the air was filled with the soft buzz of cicadas. She held her daughter close and pointed out the wildflowers blooming along the bank. For a moment, the past and present blurred, and she felt Abby's presence as a warmth in her chest, a memory that would never fade. The story of Abby Miller, like that of Elizabeth Reiser and so many others, became a reminder that the ordinary can be shattered in a single moment, but also that resilience, compassion, and courage can endure long after the world stops watching. Cold cases teach us that justice, though sometimes delayed, is still possible. Survivors remind us that hope is not naive, but necessary. And every act of remembrance keeps alive the truth that even when scars never fade, neither does love.